So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to what is the last panel of the day. And this panel is focused on fintech. But I'm sorry you were having a nice chat, but I had to actually urge you to come and take your seat because it's not yet over, unfortunately. So we need another 50 more minutes to be able to wrap up. So welcome again. I think most of you were here for Tanya's panel, but so that's nice to see you again. So before I delve into the topic at hand today and start all the discussions with all the panelists, so I would like to thank all the panelists also for having taken time out of the busy schedule to be here today and to share their insights. So I will start with a very brief introduction of all the panelists. So actually we were supposed to have Aisha Tegali, who is the founder and angel investor of FFI Angels, but she couldn't make it, unfortunately, due to unforeseen personal circumstances. She has sent her apologies. But we still have 3 other panelists, and we'll continue with that. So on my left, I've got Mark Van Beuningen. Mark, I hope I've pronounced your name properly. So Mark Van Beuningen is the Chief Executive Officer of CIM Financial Services. And Mark has also had a rich career with the Boston Consulting Group back in South Africa. Next to Mark is Munya. Munya is the founder of LakeStream, which is a PropTech startup company which is building a digital ecosystem for commercial real estate workflows. Munya has also been a senior asset manager with Grit Real Estate Income Group. Next to Munya, at the far extreme, I have Rajiv Babooram. Rajiv Babooram is the lead professional at the Economic Development Board of Mauritius, and he has cumulated various functions, one of which has been as economic counselor based at the Mauritius High Commission in Australia. So today's discussion will be divided into 4 parts. So now we'll just move towards an introduction. According to World Bank estimates, around 65% of adults in sub-Saharan Africa are unbanked. Translated into real numbers, it means around 370 million people in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, do not possess a bank account. Research has proven that financial inclusion can actually prop up GDP by around 30% in frontier markets, for example, Kenya. According to the Global Findex Database 2021 and the IFC report on the future of financial inclusion in Africa, digital financial services, which is another fancy word for fintech, is key to advancing the agenda on financial inclusion for all Africans. So, Mark, since Aisha is not here, these 2 questions actually, the next 2 questions are going to go to you. Very simply, shortly also, what is financial inclusion, please?
Financial inclusion is simply businesses or individuals having access to useful and affordable financial services that actually meet their needs. I mean, that's the official definition. And I think what you typically see and probably have experienced as an individual or business owner in Mauritius and elsewhere is that banks or financial institutions like ourselves, like CIM Finance, sell you a product. They don't actually sit down with you and say, well, what are your life needs? What part of your life cycle are you on as an individual or as an SME or business owner, understanding like what is the full ecosystem that you play in? What I call the cash conversion cycle for a business. So if you're an importer, distributor, like what if you're importing stuff, how long does that take to get to Mauritius? What you need to be able to import it, what you need to store it here, and if you're selling it, what are your payment terms? So I guess there's working capital needs across the cash conversion cycle. So I think people or professional services or financial services individuals don't do a good enough job of doing that. So I think I think we need to address that as ourselves at CIM Finance and the financial services industry as a whole.
Okay, that's a very nice summary, I would say. Mark, again, what is now the correlation according to you, between fintech and financial inclusion? Just to set the scene over here.
Well, I think it's really about easy access to financial services. So you're a traditional bricks and mortar, whether it's banks or with CIM Finance, you've got branches and counters and stores. And I mean, you have all of us have been in queues at banks or queues at one of our counters at CIM Finance, probably not you folks, or maybe earlier in your career. But it's really about building out digital channels and digital products that are easy to access for individuals. I think going further for SMEs, it's really around building a platform where SMEs can get access to lenders. So I think Fundcus, I know Paul's here is a great example of that in Mauritius. I mean, he calls it democratizing lending. I think there's companies in India and Kenya that have taken it a step further. So there's a company in Kenya called Pezesha, and we're actually in discussions with them in Kenya, and One Infinity in India. And basically what they've done is they've built a platform. They've got banks that they work with, and they've got, I know One Infinity's got 70 banks and non-banks they work with, understood their risk appetite for what SMEs they'll lend to. The SMEs will register on the platform, and then they basically get all the data from the SMEs, so the transactional data from banking, and then all the accounting information, and they can credit score those SMEs, and then give them a credit score, and then based on the risk appetite of the banks or the non-banks, feed them through there. So I think so technology effectively can be an enabler to link SMEs to banks or non-banks without the banks and non-banks having to try to do it themselves.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So we'll now move to part one of our discussion today, which is the role of Mauritius in advancing the financial inclusion agenda. So a little bit of statistics again. So Africa has, as of date, produced 5 fintech unicorns, and out of those 5 fintech unicorns, 3 of them are based in Nigeria. So what is a fintech unicorn? What is a unicorn, actually? It's very shortly, in a summarized way, it's a startup which, in a relatively short period of time, has hit the turnover mark of $1 billion. So all these companies are opening up previously underserved markets in Africa, and while they also have a substantial impact in the communities where they're operating, they're also actually financially very attractive for investors also. And according to Telim Research, which conducted a survey of 150 fintech companies in Nigeria in 2021, the majority of those fintech companies offer payment services and lending of microfunds as their business, as part of the business plan. So Rajiv, the next question is addressed to you. So I've talked about fintech unicorns. So where are we in Mauritius right now in terms of attracting those types of businesses to our shores?
Thank you, Janesh. As you rightly pointed out, there's a lot of disruptions in the fintech space, especially in Africa. Fintech is booming, and I think it is also important to understand what type of companies we're actually dealing with. It's a new industry, and the nature of fintech companies are quite different as well. If we take the example of Flutterwave, for example, if you look at the history, the founder was in his early 30s. He used to work as a software engineer at PayPal, and I think he spent a few more years at Google. And in just a matter of less than 5 years, his company was already a unicorn. So these are the types of companies that we are dealing with. And this is the nature of fintech companies. They grow really fast within such a small period of time. So coming back to the question of where are we in terms of attracting unicorns, we, the EDB, which is the government agency mandated to promote the Mauritius International Financial Center, we are in discussions with a number of fintech unicorns, and I'm talking about the really big players. They are now seriously looking at the Mauritius jurisdiction, whether to expand their services in Mauritius for money transfer, remittance business, or peer-to-peer lending facilities as well. I'm not really in a position to disclose much about that, but I can tell you that since we have introduced the licenses for virtual assets, we have seen a lot of interest from those fintech unicorns to look at Mauritius. And of course, it is interesting to bring those unicorns to Mauritius, but I think it is also important to look at companies that are not yet unicorns, but they have potential of becoming unicorns. So rather than going after the unicorns, we should also look at what they call soonicorns, soon-to-be unicorns. So that's how they call it. And I think we don't have to go far, you know. If you look at Mauritius alone, there are some really good companies that have the potential of becoming unicorns in the future. I mean, Peach Payment, for example, you know, it's a payment company that started operations last year in Mauritius, and I'm informed that they have signed up more than 100 merchants, and they are now looking at expansion in several African countries. So in that way, when we grow together with those companies, we accompany them to become unicorns, Mauritius will be part of the growth and success story. And I think this is what we should also look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. It looks very promising indeed. So the second question is again addressed to you. So what is the support that the Mauritian jurisdiction is actually providing to those fintech service providers or fintech entrepreneurs?
Thank you. Well, we do offer a wide range of support, and as you know, Mauritius is always open for innovative projects. Firstly, coming back on the issue of incubators, the government of Mauritius has introduced the National SME Incubator Scheme, which is administered by the Mauritius Research and Innovation Council. And I think there are some 6 or 7 accredited incubators where they provide coaching, nurturing, and training facilities. So depending on what stage of startup you are, whether you are at pre-incubation, there are certain grants which are available. I think for pre-incubation, it's something around 100,000 rupees. And if you are at the incubation stage, you can apply for a grant up to 400,000 rupees with the MRIC. And of course, when you graduate and start to grow, when you reach the acceleration stage, you can get funding up to 300,000 rupees. Of course, there is a steering committee which will look at all the projects, and they will evaluate and, of course, assess the risk and coach you accordingly. That's the first thing. Secondly, of course, as you know, Mauritius, we have created a conducive business environment. Mauritius is known for its political, economic, and social stability. There are no foreign exchange control. We have a flat corporate tax of 15%. We have a pool of qualified workforce. So we have a number of accountants, bankers, lawyers, all ready to assist fintech companies whether to expand in Africa or to set up in Mauritius. Also, in terms of accolade, we are ranked first on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business in Africa and 13th globally. And we are also #1 for good governance, cybersecurity, and cyber connectivity as well. And I think, thirdly, Mauritius has built an expertise when it comes to doing business in Africa. And I think this is what other fintech companies can actually use Mauritius. They can leverage on our expertise. You know, there are a lot of big companies, CL and all that, and I think CIM as well, that are expanding rapidly in Africa. And if you look at the nature of fintech companies, again, you will see there's a lot of mergers and acquisition, buyouts happening almost on a daily basis. So in that sense, of course, we can partner with those international fintech companies and then to go into Africa. Also, we have opened Mauritius to welcome ambitious and young entrepreneurs and startups. Several residency schemes have been introduced. We have the Innovator Occupational Permit. We have scrapped the minimum investment criteria. I think it used to be $40,000. So we have removed that. So if you have an innovative project, you can submit that to the EDB. There will be a committee that will assess that. And you can, of course, if you meet all the criteria, you will be eligible for an occupational permit. We also have the self-employed occupation permit, residency by investment. If you invest up to $50,000, you can qualify for an occupational permit, valid for 10 years. And we have also opened our doors for job market to foreign students. So we make it easy for foreign companies to recruit people, especially in the fintech sector, through the Young Professional Occupation Permit. And of course, we have introduced the premium visa as well. As you all know, that was introduced in the context of COVID-19, and that has worked really well. And in the context of fintech, you know, this is a great long-stay tourist visa, because all you need as a fintech entrepreneur is just an internet connection and your laptop. You don't really need office space. And that has worked really well. Again, you know, these are all the options that we have. I can go on and on for all the advantages that we have, but the most important thing is, if you are interested in Mauritius, you have an idea, come and talk to us, you know. We will find solutions for whatever problems you have, like we've done in the past. So on that note, thanks.
Thank you, Rajiv. So it really seems the ADB is very much open for business. According to an article written by a Nigerian law firm, Olisa Agbakoba Legal, Nigeria has no less than 9 regulators which are actually policing its fintech space. This also includes the Central Bank of Nigeria. So just to give you an idea, a fintech service operator, a fintech entrepreneur who wishes to set up business in Nigeria needs to go to potentially 9 regulators and have 9 particular rules and regulations actually apply to that fintech service operator. I think it's quite a lot. But à contrario, in Mauritius, we do not, the landscape is a little bit different, I would say. We have so far 2 regulators, only 2 regulators, which are the Financial Services Commission and the Bank of Mauritius. So I'll just touch a little bit now on what the Bank of Mauritius has done in terms of legislation, interesting legislation to say so. So recently, in 2019 actually, the Bank of Mauritius came up with the National Payment Systems Act, the NPSA, and it has actually stepped in to fill a previous gap regarding payment service operators, PSOs, and payment service providers. So with regard to payment services, there are no less than 8 types of sublicenses which are provided for under Part 1 of the NPSA. The Act also provides a leeway for the Bank of Mauritius to actually step in to regulate, and I quote over here, any other services functional to the transfer of money, including the issuance of electronic money. And this actually sits on all fours with the amendments that were done to the Financial Services Act back in 2020 and the Banking Act back in 2021, which actually provides a leeway in terms of the regulatory sandbox authorization, or if you want, the regulatory sandbox license, the RSL. What the RSL provides is a particular platform where fintech operators or fintech to-be operators can actually experiment with novel ideas, innovate, and bring those particular ideas to fruition within a safe space, which also protects the financial system in Mauritius from systemic risk. So now I'll touch a little bit on what the FSC has done in terms of rules, which are actually very interesting within the fintech space. So over here we're talking about 2 different rules. One is the crowdfunding rules that was passed, that was issued actually back in 2021, and the peer-to-peer lending rules that was issued in 2020. So without getting into too much detail, both of these rules, they actually granularly describe the unimpaired stated capital that a particular crowdfunding or P2P lending company should have, governance and risk factors which are actually very important to make sure that there are no risk to that particular service provider himself, and also amounts of money, which is very important also, amounts of money that can be lent and borrowed, so that, once again, there are no systemic risks that are posed to the wider financial system in Mauritius. So, Mark, again, so the question that I have for you now is, based on what I've just said, it seems that on the regulatory front, with all those rules, etc., we are fairly well heeled. But do you think, from an operational perspective, that we have the capability in Mauritius in terms of research and development and operational capabilities that fintech entails, that do we have that in Mauritius to be able to actually offer those services on a wider scale, so for example, to the African region. So for example, I'm talking over here about, let's say if someone, a service provider in Mauritius wants to set up a crowdfunding platform or a P2P platform. So we already have a platform in Mauritius, actually. But do you think we have that operational capability to be able to actually meet the demand and also all the operations from within Mauritius?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in a sec. Just, I guess for CIM Finance, we've just got our payment service provider license from the Bank of Mauritius. So we have to say, it's very, very good interactions with the Bank of Mauritius. I know people have a lot of pain with the, I guess, regulations, but I guess we had very good, constructive discussions, and the licensing process was great. We're going through our final pilot now for instant payment. I guess with Pop, Blink, and Juice around, we'll probably have to find a pretty funky name to take to market as well. And also understand users' needs. Why do people actually want to use it? But yeah, I think going to your question, I would say no. We don't, but there's no reason why we can't build it. I think as a big group, financial services group ourselves, we don't have the capability. So we built a fintech in Kenya. We want to effectively. We're going through a digital transformation initiative in Mauritius, and a lot of what we're doing, we're building up the capability as we go, and we're outsourcing a hell of a lot to whether it's South Africa or India in terms of dev and advanced analytics. So I think it's where Mauritius is now. It's come across like it's a fantastic journey since the 80s, and I think we've got a very strong base of qualified people here. And you can see that from the confidence that international companies are doing a lot of their BPO activities here, including actually software development now. So our software developers are getting poached into these companies, but it's still for, I guess, quite like repetitive type tasks. So if you're looking at it's becoming more sophisticated, and the skills that you need in fintech, it's really around full stack software development programming, and you can read up what that means. I won't explain it now. And then effectively, like it's, I guess, advanced analytics, machine learning, AI type of capabilities. So, and that is stuff that can get taught quite quickly. And we've actually got the ALC here, so African Leadership College. And the African Leadership Group bought Halberton a few months ago. I don't know if any of you saw that, but Halberton is a Silicon-based software development and data science training institute. They train all the guys that go, or people that go into Google, Amazon, etc. So I guess they've, and African Leadership Group got a couple $100 million from the MasterCard Foundation, so I guess they could afford to buy it. And so given they're here, given they have these programs, they're literally 12 months programs, so we could, I think as companies or the private sector collaborated and actually got them to set up shop here as well, we could really build that skill set quite quickly. I'm actually discussing with Fred Swaneker, the founder, next week what we can do for CIM, but I think more broadly we should collaborate as the private sector and see how can we take our talent in Mauritius and take it up to the next level. So we do have lots of talent, just needs a bit more training to get to the next level.
Thank you, Mark. So we now move to part 2 of our panel discussion. We shall focus on the financing of a fintech venture. Some statistics again. So Africa-focused fintech startups have, over the last 3 years, received more investment than other sectors. It's very notable, actually. Also, in 2021, Africa has received $5.2 billion through VC funding, which actually represents a record amount of funding that have come to the shores of Africa. So, Mark, again, do you see an appetite from venture capital investors and private equity investors to actually invest within the fintech space in Mauritius to cover the wider African market region?
I definitely think there's appetite. I think the Catapult Accelerator program, if any of you know about it, has proved that. I think there's been mixed feedback in terms of they've just done the first round, and I guess I looked at the LinkedIn post the other day, and there's a bit of a mixed feedback around that. I think it's a really good start. I think it shows a great collaboration between CL, IBL, MCB, and Crimji Group, I think it is, and Catapult, obviously. And they basically put together an incubator, and they're bringing, they went through about 600 agri-tech startups and identified 7. They're going to bring the 7 here and basically support them to go through their business expansion, etc. But I think the EDB and I guess the regulators here have done a great job in terms of setting the foundations we need from a regulatory perspective. But I think as a country, we need to understand what is the ecosystem we need to build to support this. And that's really around understanding that you're going from, I guess, if you're doing a startup, it's concept, but it goes through growth, and then obviously you get more mature as a company. So, and that requires angel investors, VC, private equity. We've got, I guess, I think you mentioned FFI angels. I know there's more angels here as well. So there's some good, I guess, angels here as well. But I think if the private sector again collaborated and really did what has been done for Catapult and said, okay, we want fintech here as well. That's agri-tech. We want fintech as well. Let's get some of the big financial services institutions together with the Mauritius African Fintech Hub as well, and I guess with the EDB, and just see what we can really do together to bring it here. So I think we've got a great advantage as a very well trusted and established IFC that's had billions of dollars of flows into Africa. To be able to track that investment here, we just need, I guess, to build the ecosystem together and then build our talent here, but we can also bring in talent. And I mean, software devs, you can use people sitting in India, South Africa, Europe as well. So I guess there's ways to do it, but we need to collaborate together to do it.
Thank you, Mark. Munya, I now turn my attention to you. According to you, what are those venture capital and private equity investors looking for specifically before investing in a fintech business in Mauritius that will not only cover Mauritius, but also serve the wider African region?
Yeah, sure. So that's a difficult question. Look, I think that's a question that every founder or entrepreneur really hopes they have the crystal ball to, have the answer to. It's a tough one. You mentioned Nigeria earlier on, and how, coming out of Nigeria, we've seen, I think, a few fintech startups, we've seen a few unicorns. And if one tries to compare the population in Nigeria, you're looking at 217 million odd people relative to 1.3 million in Mauritius. Scale is a big factor that investors are looking for, which is difficult in the context of Mauritius. But I think outside of scale, it's a great product. It's a great team that's able to execute and actually bring the product to market. And I think every investor out there is definitely looking for, I think, a meaningful financial upside. And I think more specific to fintech businesses, a lot of what matters is being able to play within the regulated space. So you look at, for example, what we're doing over at LakeStream, where we're basically trying to allow individual investors to participate in commercial real estate by leveraging the blockchain to basically fractionalize and allow people to come in for as little as $500. It's mostly unregulated within most of the continent. So a lot of what takes you from 0 to 1 is the ability to sit within the regulated space, which really is where Mauritius is thriving. So I think to the extent that you can't say maybe scale in Mauritius, to the extent that you look at, say, maybe great team, great product, those are mostly independent of jurisdiction. But I think where Mauritius really has a unique positioning to thrive is, I think, infrastructure and on the regulation front. So infrastructure, there's definitely great internet penetration. There's a great financial services ecosystem, and there's great quality distribution. And I mean that in the context of the island is small enough for entrepreneurs to be able to spread their product without necessarily breaking the bank. On the regulation front, I think the EDB, the FSC has really gone to town in terms of very clearly articulating what's required to be regulated within some of the spaces. So take fractionalization, for example. I think 3 years back we saw the FSC introduce the security trading token system, and more recently we've seen the Vitus Act. So I think there's definitely real effort and traction in terms of regulating uncharted territory, uncharted waters that's unregulated, which mostly is the space we're playing in fintech. So I think there's a lot going for the country that would get investors excited, where yes, there's no scale, but I think if the country positions itself as, look, come to Mauritius, set up, test the waters, leverage this regulatory framework, and illustrate to your investors how there is clear line of sight to then drive scale across the continent, then I think it's something that can get investors excited about the country.
Thank you, Munya. This summary is actually very insightful. So there is a third question, but it is actually directed to Aisha, so we'll just move on to part 3 now. Where we'll be looking at benchmarking Mauritius against other African jurisdictions, and I'm over here talking very specifically about Rwanda. According to Fintech Times, not less than 52 fintech startups are presently operating from Rwanda. Out of those 52 fintech startups, 24 of those fintech startups are actually headquartered in Rwanda. So they range from providing solutions to microfinance institutions to mobile money systems. So Rwanda has a fintech association to show that it is actually serious about it. So Rwanda has got its own fintech association, which, surprise, surprise, is called the Rwanda Fintech Association. Yeah, actually it resembles the platform that we already have in Mauritius, which is the MAFH, which is the Mauritius Africa Fintech Hub. And both the MAFH and the Rwanda Fintech Association are actually platforms for potential fintech operators to actually collaborate, share ideas, innovate, etc., etc. Mark. So Rwanda is slowly positioning itself as a fintech hub on the African continent. How much do you think Rwanda is a serious challenger to the Mauritius Fintech Hub initiative?
Well, I think the numbers speak for themselves. So I think they're quite far ahead of us already. And just to caveat my observations, and a lot of what I'm saying now is I had a call yesterday with Michael Szymanski, the Mauritian African Fintech Hub CEO, or I think he's on sabbatical for 3 months in Rwanda. So he's been exploring what's happening there. So I guess I got some very good insight there, but these are, I guess, a mix of his opinions and my opinions. I think it's very, I mean, they're definitely far ahead of us. But I think we've got, I mean, like what Munya said is spot on. I think we need to understand where we want to play. And I think what Munya said is exactly where we want to play, because we've got, I guess the IFC, like I said before, is very well established, very trusted. Rwanda's tried to set up an IFC, but it's going to take them decades to get to where Mauritius is. So I think we need to leverage that point. I think we need to leverage all the points that Munya mentioned with the great regulatory frameworks that we've got, like what the EDB's doing as well, and I guess as a testing ground into Africa. And I think if we can get that ecosystem I mentioned before, and setting up incubators with interested corporates, whether it's Mauritians collaborating with African corporates or international corporates, or I guess entities like Catapult, and really coming together here to build that ecosystem, but then having a very strong positioning as what exactly is Mauritius for fintech startups. Because it's not going to, like Munya said, scale is so important for fintechs. You're never going to have anyone investing into a fintech that's addressing Mauritius. It needs to be Mauritius as the testing ground, and then the idea is to expand into Africa. Because the unit economics might be good here, but if you're an investor, you're looking for scale.
Thanks, Mark. The second question actually is also addressed to you again. So you actually stated that indeed Rwanda seems to be like a serious challenger to Mauritius. It's actually seriously positioning itself within the fintech space. But just to dive into it a little bit more, do you think Rwanda has a unique selling point that would entice potential investors within the fintech space to actually choose Rwanda over Mauritius?
Yeah, again, this answer is colored a bit by my discussion with Michael. So I think Rwanda is, if you're looking at East Africa in particular, which is obviously, if you take the East African market, it's a huge market with Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, etc. So I think they're uniquely positioned there to be close to the East African market. and take advantage of any treaties or, I guess, trade stuff they got there, and obviously also closer to talent. And then they can say, well, Rwanda's small, but it's 12 million people, but it's small. But you can be based here, test here, and expand into East Africa. So I think it's quite uniquely positioned there compared to Mauritius, which might seem far away for some people compared to, I guess, Rwanda. I think what's unique about Rwanda is the president, Paul Kagame. I don't know if any of you have ever heard him speak, but you can say what you want about how democratic or not Rwanda is, but he's certainly someone who's pushing hard to take Rwanda to the next level. And I think from what Michael said, he understands that building financial services, I guess some kind of hub, whether it's IFC, Fintech hub in Rwanda, is critical. So he's the guy on the trail pushing for this as the president of the country. And he's going to, I had a conference 3 years back in Cape Town, and he came to the conference, and I'm a member of YPO, which is a global organization of CEOs, and it was a global conference. We had 2,500, I think, CEOs from around the world there. Paul Kagame came there and gave us a pitch about Rwanda, and he does that at a lot of conferences. So I think he's understood well what needs to happen in Rwanda. He's going out there as a salesperson for Rwanda, and because of, I guess, the government leadership style, he can just push it down quite quickly.
So, according to you, actually being landlocked in Africa, and the leadership and all the leadership style is actually playing a big role.
Yeah, I think it's a great facilitator. Right? Like, I think if you look at, I guess Ethiopia is another good example where or China, maybe not Ethiopia, but China. I mean, Ethiopia is trying to mimic China, but China, like, through, I guess, a very clear 5-year economic plans, very, like, I guess, top-down approach or dictatorial approaches, has taken China from where it was in the 80s to where it is now. And I guess Kagame is trying to do something similar, but more business-friendly. So that's helped a lot. And I guess it's very hard to mimic that because we have a proper democracy in Mauritius. But I think and I think maybe it's a private sector, the EDB, that need to come together and collaborate better to take that message out.
Thank you, Mark. Munya, from an operator's perspective, what do you think, according to your experience, what can Mauritius do actually to ensure that it imposes itself as a jurisdiction of choice to attract those fintech service providers and basically woo them to Mauritius rather than going to Rwanda?
Yeah. Look, I think the competition is not just Rwanda. You think of Cape Town in South Africa, you think of Nairobi in Kenya, you think of Kigali in Rwanda. The competition landscape is difficult for the simple reason that these guys are on the mainland. They've been at it for a minute, and basically the startup ecosystem within this space is evolved. And you add the population dynamics we spoke about earlier on that make scale possible in these markets. So it's a competitive landscape, but I think there's a lot of good that's in country, that's in Mauritius. And I think the way I would approach it, if I was in the position of the EDB, is something like, how do we double down on what we're good at? There's this adage, within the startup space, something like, you're not looking to boil the ocean. You want to pick a niche and double down on that niche, understand what you do well and do that one thing and one thing alone. So in my mind, I think, Mauritius is uniquely positioned to be, I think, the back office function of African startups, if you will. So, I'd really double down on this regulation element, where for the most part, the sense that I get is Mauritius is already ahead of the curve. You look at, I spoke about the STTS. South Africa only just recently promulgated the Crowdfunding Act. I think it was year before last, if you will. So I think doubling down on that space would uniquely position Mauritius. Mark touched on this, the intersection of startups and the private sector. You look at what's going to happen in Delaware, where investors out of Silicon Valley will be very honest with you and tell you, look, if your startup is not a Delaware C Corp, we can't deploy capital into your startup, for the simple reason that what Delaware has gone and done over the years is they have built solid dispute resolution infrastructure where both the investors and the entrepreneurs have a very clear sense of, look, if we sign this contract and things go south, this is how the courts are going to decide the matter. So I think in the context of Mauritius, if they double down on regulation and do that well, do that efficiently, and begin to shift the narrative from don't just come to Mauritius and buy a beachfront property. Complement that narrative with something like, yes, you can do that, but if you are a founder and entrepreneur who's pursuing a Pan-African strategy, come to Mauritius, and in 10 days, we'll have you set up with a regulatory compliant vehicle. We'll make it such that your tax legislation is simple. You can leverage our legislation to maximize tax efficiencies, and you can leverage our banking infrastructure to basically flow funds from your operations on mainland Africa into Mauritius. Then that becomes a very compelling value proposition. Very quickly someone can think, okay, I'm gonna pack my bags, relocate to Mauritius, and set my startup here. So I think taking those case studies, a dollar way, leveraging what we're doing well, doubling down on that would basically make, in my mind, Mauritius the jurisdiction of choice.
Thank you, Munya. Very interesting insights there. But I think, as Rajiv said earlier, that the EDB and the government in general, from what I understand, is they are working really hard at trying to make Mauritius a jurisdiction of choice. So, but I think there's always room for improvement, shall I say. So we now move to the final part of our panel discussion today, which is going to be focused on virtual assets ecosystem in Mauritius. In early 2022, Mauritius adopted the VITOS Act. So the VITOS Act is the Virtual Asset Initial Tokens Offering Services Act, quite a mouthful there, which applies to any VASPs, being Virtual Asset Service Providers, and ITOs, being Issuers of Initial Token Offering. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of acronym there. That's the way it is. And what actually happens is those VASPs, those Virtual Asset Service Providers and Issuers of Initial Token Offerings, they are when they fall under the VITOS Act, they are regulated when they carry on business from Mauritius or in Mauritius. Additionally, not less than 9 other rules have seen the light of the day very recently, which have been issued actually by the FSC, and which actually supplement the VITOS Act. So if you want to have a interpretation, if you want to have a further look on those rules, we have actually done some pretty interesting work on that. You might log on to our website to have a look at how we have analyzed those rules. In addition to that, the FSC has also published the AML CFT guidance notes on virtual asset service providers and issuers of initial token offerings, which actually addresses the risk of money laundering and financing of terrorism, which is always inherent in virtual asset transactions. So we take the VITOS, we take the 9 rules, we take the AML-CFT guidance on VASPs and ITOs. It seems that the regulatory landscape for virtual assets in Mauritius is fairly complete for the time being. Rajiv, 2 questions for you right now. Against this background, I understand that the EDB has been doing some pretty intense work, shall I say, in promoting the capabilities of Mauritius in attracting virtual asset service providers and issuers of initial token offerings. I understand that there is a particular story over here, how Mauritius came up with the VITOS Act.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that's a very interesting question, Janesh. The VITOS Act was actually introduced as a result of Recommendation 15 of the Financial Action Task Force, which requires virtual asset service providers to be regulated for AML and CFT purposes. I think it is important to look back. We had the option of making amendments to our existing legislation. We could have amended the Financial Services Act 2007 or the Securities Act 2005. But we decided to come up with a fully comprehensive legislation to regulate virtual assets, virtual asset service providers, or issuers of ITOs, to send a very strong message to the authorities internationally that how serious Mauritius is in terms of combating terrorism financing and AML CFT purposes. And Mauritius is among the very few countries in the southern and eastern African region that has introduced a legislation to regulate virtual assets. This act went into Parliament on the 8th of December last year, and it came into force on the 7th of February this year. And I think the FSC took a couple of months to finalize the licensing requirements, the fees, how many directors you need, what are the structures that you can apply for those licenses, etc. So again, I mean, if you've been following the news, you will know that last week we had a very strong delegation that went to Zambia for the ASAM lag. And Mauritius is the first country in Africa that is rated as largely compliant on the recommendation 15. And we are one of the very few countries in the world, I think the 6 countries in the world, which has achieved 40 out of 40 FATF recommendations. And this is a great achievement. Today when we see other countries approaching us and they're asking us for assistance, they want to learn from us, how did we actually come out of the FATF grey list in record times to being compliant or largely compliant on all 40 FATF recommendations. I think this is something that we should all be very proud of. And also from my experience, when I talk to big fintech players, I feel that they come to Mauritius because they want to be regulated. There's a lot of scams and all that's happening in this space. And of course, by being regulated, it enhances the credibility, it offers investment protection, and of course, the trust in the client as well is likely to increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. So the second question again to you. What has the Economic Development Board done to actually promote this new product offering, which is the VITOS Act and all its rules, etc.?
As I said earlier, there's a lot of I'm talking about the really big players that are now looking at Mauritius. So what is the EDB doing? See, we have a very focused and targeted approach. We approach based on a lot of market intelligence. We approach companies that we feel if they come to Mauritius, it will add value to their business. So again, we have a very focused and targeted approach. We are still in the process of finalizing our marketing strategy. We are planning to participate in a number of international roadshows, events and all that, to try and create awareness about this new series of licenses.
Thank you, Rajiv. Munya, you will have the honor to actually respond to the next 2 questions and to close the 4th part. So from an operational perspective, what, according to you, are the prerequisites that someone looking to establish a virtual asset exchange, so for example in Mauritius, is looking for? Very broad terms.
With you. I feel like this one should be going to Rajiv, no? Look, I think it depends on the nature of the virtual assets that you're looking to trade. And basically you've got 2 broad categories. And to give it context, a virtual asset is basically a digital representation of value. So the question really becomes, what is the value, the underlying asset that's being represented by this token? So imagine for a second that the underlying value is, say, security. Securities, you're thinking of equity, you're thinking of debt, any debt instrument, think debentures, think bond instruments. Then you'd fall under the STTS, Security Token Trading System. I think that's about 3 years old. To the extent that the underlying virtual asset is simply a representation of value. So think maybe a smart contract, think attributable rights to the token holder or to the holder of the virtual asset. Then you fall under the recently promulgated VITOS Act. So there's like a slew of requirements. I won't touch on all of them. I think as you'd imagine, I think for the securities, I think the FSC has really gone to town in terms of making those requirements pretty onerous, because really what you're purporting to be fractionalizing or virtualizing is an underlying asset. So it can be a painting, it can be a building, it can be equity within commercial real estate, et cetera, et cetera. So basically you've got to illustrate to the regulator, how is the actual trade going to occur on your platform? So when the individual comes on board, like what are the protection measures to make them actually trade, like practically speaking? That's one element. The next element is who's the underlying holder of the token. So you've got to illustrate the KYC that the individuals are going to go through, et cetera, et cetera. The big element next is basically on protection of those tokens. So think cybersecurity. I think there's an in-depth section that speaks to how you've mitigated counterterrorism, how you've mitigated anti-money laundering, basically the policies you have surrounding cybersecurity. And then the other big pillar there is definitely operations. So think post-trade reporting, think what happens when the internet is down, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long list. So that's on the STTS. I think worth mentioning is the minimum capital requirements. I think 35 million rupees for the STTS. And I think another key element there is to the extent that the issuer of the token is not targeting accredited investors. I think in Mauritius you call them expert investors. These are investors with a net worth that is greater than $100,000. Then obviously you've got to issue a prospectus, and that's another painful process where you've got to go through the auditing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's on the securities front. And then on the virtual assets front, I think that's less onerous, but I think definitely there's still there's work that needs to be done there. It's basically the prerequisite is a white paper from your legal counsel that's speaking to why it is you fall under the ambit of the Vitus Act. So basically what the FSC has gone and done is they've put the onus on the startups, on the companies to say, look, engage with your lawyers, run through the legislation, and put forward this white paper that illustrates why you think you fall within the ambit of this regulation, if you will. The capital requirements are less stringent, and I think it's more a function of where in the vertical you sit. So imagine for a second you're a broker who's dealing with virtual assets. I think the minimum capital requirement is 2 million rupees. And then if you're a platform, something like what we're building, and you're providing the entire marketplace where the different participants can play, I think the minimum capital requirement is some 6.5 million rupees. Yes, just keep me honest here. Yeah. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's it. And I think that's a lot of the pain that we're dealing with. But yeah, if anyone is interested to deep dive, you can find me after, and we can talk about it. But it's a long list. But I think Rajiv is your man.
Thank you, Munya, for a very hands-on approach on this particular question. So,
the bane of my existence.
Okay, we move on. So, the last question, Munya. You know, the whole idea behind blockchain/crypto assets is the whole principle behind it actually is that there doesn't need to be a central authority. So do you think that the regulatory landscape has now become over-policed in relation to the fact that at the very outset what crypto assets were meant to be is they didn't need to have a central authority. They were not supposed to, actually. So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that I'm the right person to ask again. Look, so I spent the first 5 odd years of my career as an auditor, PwC, banking and capital markets. And that's a very regulated space, yeah? So personally, I relish regulation. I think it's a good thing, it's positive. I think insofar as it relates to virtual assets, think blockchain. I think when people hear blockchain, what they immediately think of is cryptocurrency, yeah? They think of Bitcoin, and they think the core value drivers behind this asset class, for the most part, are still ambiguous, if you will. So I think there's skepticism, and the skepticism is there for good reason. Let's take Bitcoin, for example. You know, at its height, I think Bitcoin was trading at over 60,000 US dollars, and it's taken a beating recently, and now the value has dropped to under 20,000. So the skepticism is valid. It's valid, and I think the issue that needs to happen is we've got to take a step back and think, let's interrogate these technologies for what they actually are. Let's strip out blockchain from cryptocurrency. Blockchain is really just the technology on top of which that cryptocurrencies sit. So if I try and break it down for you, it's basically, in layman's terms, it's a chain of information. So imagine a block that's housing information that is sitting on this distributed ledger, and you've got these nodes all across the world, and upon validation, you've got a timestamp that can't be erased. It's immutable. So you've got this ledger that you can basically utilize to do just about anything. And the example I like to use, you know, you're a lawyer, Janesh, you understand this. Imagine for a second, you know, you're on a call with one of your clients, and they're not happy with 1 or 2 things that you've done, etc. And say maybe they're shouting at you, for example. using language that is uncouth, you know. You won't complain about Mauritius Telecom, right? You complain about the way the client has positioned their messaging to you, yeah? And they need a bit of questioning. It's the same thing with the blockchain, and that's the approach we've gone and adopted at LakeStream to say, this is a technology that helps us solve a lot of the problems we're facing on the continent, problems related to the transfer of value, problems related to liquidity, and problems related to access insofar as it relates to, you know, asset classes that a lot of the people on the continent historically did not have access to. So think commercial real estate, you know, think hospitality, think office buildings, et cetera, yeah? And a lot of what's preventing adoption is this skepticism surrounding digitalization, surrounding virtualization. Now, to the extent that the FSC can come on board and play Big Brother and regulate the space, then we're able to go to our retail investors and say, look, we've got Big Brother here in the FSC in Mauritius, we've got Big Brother in the EDB, we've got Big Brother in the SEC in America. We are fully regulated, the underlying assets make sense, and this is the opportunity you've been waiting for to access assets that have historically been gated. So I think, I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, I think we welcome regulation. It's positive, and it gets us moving the ball forward.
Thank you, Munya. I think that was the answer I was looking for. So, gentlemen, sorry, but Aisha is not here, but closing comments now. So that's the end of all the 4 parts. So very briefly, do you see Mauritius establishing itself as a fintech hub and Mauritius enjoying that same level of success that it has had under the MIFC initiative, MIFC being the Mauritius International Financial Center initiative? So, Rajiv, start with you.
Thank you, Janesh. Look, I mean, if we look back, you know, I think it's fair to say that we have done a lot of progress in the fintech sector. You know, when we started with the RSL license, we granted, I think, close to 9 licenses were delivered. And together with the companies, we've crafted the legislation. And, but of course, the work doesn't stop here. We know that there's a lot to be done. And it's a new industry that we are going. It's a bit similar to how the financial services sector was developed in the year 90s, you know, and you know, it's a bit of a learning phase, not just for the EDB, you know, even the regulators, the FSC are learning with the companies. So the spirit is there, you know, we are all learning together to try and come up with solutions like we did in the past. I remember there was a company for peer-to-peer who was in the P2P lending business, and we fought really hard to try and amend the Banking Act Section 52 of the Banking Act 2004 to try and give them access to the MCIB. So these are examples on how we've worked together with the operators to find solutions, concrete solutions for the problems that they are facing. Thank you.
Munya?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. And Rajiv, he's spot on. As recently as 2 weeks back, you know, through our management company, we actually engaged with the FSC, and I think if they double down on that regulation space and, you know, partner with startups who are also innovating within that space to make the process more efficient, I think Mauritius is uniquely positioned to be that back office for African startups that are pursuing a Pan-African strategy. They've gone beyond just giving you the act. You know, the act comes across and, you know, a couple of months later, you've got like supplementary rules, you've got explanatory notes that make it very simple to understand. And, you know, with a decent legal team, management company that can engage with the FSC on your behalf, you know, they're engaging with operators to try and make the legislation better. So I think doubling off of that, doubling off of the infrastructure, you know, the banking, financial services, the legislation, I think there's a niche for Mauritius, and I think the future looks positive.
Mark, the honor goes to you now.
Yeah, I think it looks positive. I have to say, after hearing Munya's stories, I'm even more, I guess, more positive. But I think it's like I said before, we need to understand what our niche is, and I think Munya's spot on in terms of like, let's use it as the back office hub. But at the same time, I think we do need to invest into talent in Mauritius, like I said, and why not use like the African Leadership Group that's already here, that's just bought a world-class like software development and and data science training institution, get them to come here. And I think I think what needs to happen is, I guess, constructive feedback to ourselves as the corporate sector and to the EDB is that we need to speak more to each other and collaborate better. A lot of this stuff I've heard for the first time. And I think there's not much, I guess, in Mauritius in general, it's quite, I guess companies are usually quite siloed within themselves, I guess as companies, but then vis-a-vis each other. So there's not much collaboration that happens here, and maybe it's the same globally. But I think we need to really come together, whether it's under the ambit of the Mauritian African Fintech Hub, or it's as financial services players, or it's, I guess, big corporates in general. I think we need to do a much better job and support what needs to happen here.
Thank you, everyone. And with this, we now come to the end of our panel discussion. So it has been a very enriching, I would say, conversation with all of you, where you have shared your experience, insights, fears, and also aspirations, actually. So thanks a lot, gentlemen, today for having actually come over here and given your time. And thank you. So now I turn to the audience. Thanks a lot, all of you, each and every one of you, actually, for having stayed for this last stretch. I know it is it's late afternoon, it's Friday, you all want to do something else, maybe we'll go for a drink or something, but definitely from the bottom of my heart and from the Horizon Legal team, we thank you wholeheartedly for having attended the panel discussions today. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the weekend.